Hello, my name is Omar Harami. I work at Sabil at the Jerusalem office. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering as we address Israel's ongoing and abusive use of administrative detention as a tool of occupation. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcasted live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being shared in the chat so that others may join. We're now inviting people from the audience to tell us how you are applying Kumi Now back in your community or are otherwise advocating for Palestine. If you have any idea of a project you'd like to share for up to 5 minutes in future meetings, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com. I will be sharing first the news on the ground, and I will be your MC. Charlotte?
Yes.
Could you please briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Charlotte Cates. I'm the International Coordinator of Savidun Palestinian Prisoners Solidarity Network, and it's an honor to be here with you today.
Thank you. It's our honor and privilege to have you with us, Charlotte. I will be sharing with you a news update from the ground. News just came out that Sudan, which would be the sixth Arabic country to normalize relationship with Israel, which comes expected because there was news leaks from in the media a few months ago that relationships are improving between Sudan and Israel. This is very unfortunate for us Palestinians because we've always relied on our Arab brothers and sisters to support and advocate on behalf of Palestinians. Although it doesn't shock us, it seems that this is part of the deal of the century of Trump, continues to move forward. We are still feeling a bit disappointed. Kabalan village, which is a village to the north of the West Bank, has received, the army came in yesterday and ordered and gave 13 orders. 8 orders to stop the building of Palestinian homes inside the village and 5 demolition orders. So this continues. Village by village are being targeted on a daily basis, and this is the latest news from Kabalan village. Palestinian elections are supposed to take place in May, although now Israel seems to refuse for Palestinian elections to take for East Jerusalem to be part of the elections, which is creating a major challenge for the Palestinian Authority. Some voices are calling, regardless if we are allowed to hold it in Jerusalem or not, it should be, the elections should go forward. Others are saying that this would create a political problem because this is, in a way, we are acknowledging the annexation of East Jerusalem to Israel. So there's lots of debate and confusion whether the elections will take place or not. Palestinian prisoners, which is related to the topic of today. There are 4 Palestinian prisoners. Some of them are on hunger strike in protest of their continuation, them being held by Israel without being charged or trial. Others are just advocating for an improved conditions. This is not usually made in the mainstream news. Imad, I would like to ask you to hold the 4 Palestinian prisoners. Their names are Imad Sawarke. He's 37 years old from Jericho. He's been for 33 days on a hunger strike. And Saeed Abu Abeid, he's 31 years old from Jenin, and he just completed his 15th day of hunger strike, which even makes it more difficult. These are especially during the month of Ramadan. Mus'ab Al-Hur, he's 33 years old. He's from Hebron, and with his friend Mohammed Al who is 45 years old from Bethlehem, are both have joined the hunger strike for 8 days so far. There are expectations that more will move into joining the hunger strike, but that is yet to be determined. For people who would like to receive more news, regular news, we encourage you to join the Sabil Wave of Prayer. And it's a short, brief summary of the major things that are happening in the country. We now turn to our main issue of the week and our special guest. As Charlotte will speak, if you're thinking of a question, please type in the chat, and we will try to ask as many of them as possible, given the time constraint. So, Charlotte, please.
Before I begin formally, I do want to thank Kumi now again and Sabil again for inviting me and inviting Samidoun to be part of this discussion, as well as for including the 4 Palestinian prisoners currently on hunger strike as part of the summary of important news that's currently taking place in Palestine. It's an honor to join you today, and I look forward to presenting and also discussing with you after the presentation has come to an end. Should I begin now or should I wait?
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
So we don't want to delay.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And I'm just going to share a presentation on my screen just to kind of guide the discussion and highlight some key points that I think will be helpful as we go through and talk about the struggle of Palestinian political prisoners, and specifically the way in which administrative detention as a policy reflects in the Israeli colonialist policy of mass incarceration targeting the Palestinian civilian population as a whole. So when we speak about Palestinian political prisoners, when we speak about their struggle, we talk about administrative detention, it's important to remember that the people that are held in administrative detention constitute a huge diverse sector of the Palestinian population. Palestinian detainees are from every political sector and every social sector of society. They're teachers and doctors and students and workers and farmers. They're mothers and fathers and sons and daughters and cousins and uncles and aunts. And the reality is that political imprisonment touches nearly every Palestinian family, whether that's through administrative detention, through the military courts, through unjust arrest and interrogation, or through some other form of detention, siege, and incarceration practiced by the Israeli state against Palestinians. So these are some of the statistics about Palestinian political prisoners that are current in the present time. And it's important to note that these are gathered by Palestinian human rights organizations, in many cases, the same organizations that actually provide legal representation to Palestinian prisoners and provide support for their family members inside as they're kept away from their loved ones due to Israeli imprisonment. And the Palestinian human rights organizations need to rely on figures given by an Israeli representative of the prison authority under the laws that require this information to be released. But that information is not always reliable, it's not always accurate, and it's not always updated. And last year during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still going on, the position that was responsible for releasing this information went unfilled for over a year, which meant that Palestinian human rights organizations were actually left to estimate these numbers based on information that could be gained from communities and family reports and things like this, which just really shows the extent to which Israel attempts to isolate Palestinians by locking them up behind behind bars, and the lack of regard it shows for keeping track of and reporting on the most basic aspects of the conditions and life of who is being jailed by the Israeli occupation. So right now there are approximately 4,500 total political prisoners inside Israeli jails. Israel uses a term actually which we could understand as that of a political prisoner. We could understand that as that sort of a classification of a political prisoner or a prisoner of war. And that is use the term security prisoner. And a security prisoner is a term that's pretty much specifically applied to Palestinians, and it's differentiated from Israeli quote unquote criminal prisoners. Or social prisoners or civil prisoners. And what this designates specifically is that this person is being imprisoned by the Israeli occupation because they are a Palestinian, quote unquote, for nationalist reasons, i.e., for seeking freedom and justice and liberation for Palestinians. Now, of that number, 450 are administrative detainees, which means they're jailed without charge, without trial, under a so-called secret file that even their lawyers do not have access to challenge that information. And Palestinians can spend years at a time imprisoned under administrative detention orders. We'll go into more detail later about exactly how these orders work, but it's important to note that they're a form of psychological torture and collective punishment for Palestinian prisoners and their families as well, because every person who is detained under an administrative detention order never knows whether it is going to be renewed. That person can be waiting for release, and their families can be waiting for them to come home and celebrate them and welcome them coming home. And a new administrative detention order can be imposed upon them at any minute. And once again, there's no charge involved. There's no trial. There's only a reference to secret evidence, which is never revealed and can therefore never be substantially challenged. There are 37 Palestinian women prisoners, around 140 Palestinian children who are detained by Israel, which is another very important issue that it needs international attention and care and support. And really what we can see here is that all sectors of the Palestinian society are targeted, and no matter where those Palestinians are living, no matter where their area of residence is or their experience, or whether they're an elected member of the Palestinian Legislative Council, or whether they're a fisher and a farmer in the seas and the colonially imposed borders of Gaza, they can be targeted for imprisonment and incarceration, arrest, torture, and detention by the Israeli occupation. So again, who are the Palestinian prisoners? They are many different things. They are community leaders, they are political leaders, they're organizers, they're folks who bring together their communities, they're artists and dancers. Right now, one of the cases that is receiving international attention is that of Atta Khatab. He's a Palestinian debka dancer, and he is currently being detained and interrogated by the Israeli occupation. They're workers and students and teachers, of all genders, members of families, loved ones, and again, hundreds of children and youth as well. And we say that since 1967, around 1 million Palestinians have been imprisoned by Israel for political reasons. But it's also important to note that Israeli imprisonment of Palestinians didn't begin in 1967. In 1948, with the initial occupation of 78% of Palestine, the newly established Israeli state declared martial law over the parts of Palestine that it had occupied. And so the Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians was also accompanied by martial law being imposed upon those Palestinians who remained on their land. And in fact, in many ways, what we currently see taking place, for example, in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, is a blueprint that was initially developed inside occupied Palestine, 1948. And so this isn't a problem that began in 1967. It's inherent to the Israeli occupation. Currently, over 40% of Palestinian men in the West Bank and also in Jerusalem have spent time in Israeli prison or detention. And what this means is that every Palestinian family in one way or another is affected by mass imprisonment and incarceration. In addition, virtually every Palestinian prisoner faces some form of torture or abuse during their arrest or interrogation. This can be physical torture, this can be physical violence, this can be psychological torture, this can be threats against family members, attempts at intimidation, and it can be the use of repeated solitary confinement, including used against children. So this is a very common experience of Palestinians who are detained by the Israeli occupation. And it also, just to note that the Palestinian prisoners are detained inside inside Israel, inside the Green Line, inside occupied Palestine 48. And this comes in direct violation of international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention. But one of the other things that it also does is it aims to cut Palestinian prisoners off from their family members and off from the people who love them and the people who provide them with support and sustenance. Because not only can Palestinian political prisoners themselves be denied family visits, and this is something that happens on a regular basis. For example, like the 4 men we were speaking about earlier who are on hunger strike. In many cases, one of the punishments for engaging in a hunger strike is denial of family visits, and this is a form of discipline that is used by the Israeli occupation. Women prisoners were subjected to denial of family visits for creating a Palestinian flag out of their garments and raising it in the yard of the prison on the anniversary of the Nakba on one occasion. However, this isn't the only way in which Palestinian prisoners are denied family visits, and this isn't the only way in which Palestinian detainees are kept away from their families. Because of where these prisons are located, once again, in violation of international law, in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, family members have to receive special permits just to get on the buses operated by the International Committee of the Red Cross to visit their family members inside Israeli prisons. And in many cases, various forms of security excuses are used to prevent family members from receiving these permits. For example, in many cases, people who were themselves formerly imprisoned are denied such permits, which once again cuts off Palestinian detainees from their families. And the experience of arrest, which precedes detention, can take place in many different ways. Palestinians are arrested at home, they're taken in at checkpoints, they're taken in the streets. In the most common form, and this is kind of a bit of news that is almost a daily piece of news. In fact, it is a daily piece of news in Palestine. There are armed, violent military raids which take place in the middle of the night in the early dawn hours, breaking into families' homes. In many cases, doors are actually blown off the hinges with explosives. And, dozens of heavily armed occupation soldiers traipsing into a family's home, grabbing a loved one and a family member, taking them away, throwing them in the back of the military jeep, and terrorizing the entire family, often ransacking the contents of the house. In many cases, Palestinian detainees are thrown in the back of jeeps, are hidden, are hit, beaten, and kicked by occupation soldiers as they are being taken to a settlement, a military base, or an interrogation center. And this practice of night raids is also used to arrest and imprison Palestinian children as young as 12. So night raids are something that can be incredibly traumatizing for children who experience them, not only night raids targeting themselves, but also these kinds of raids targeting their family members. When speaking about child prisoners, every year there are around 500 to 700 Palestinian children who are arrested and detained by the Israeli occupation. Palestinian children can even be subjected to administrative detention orders, detention without charge or trial on the basis of a so-called secret file. And you can see that there are many more children who are arrested each year than those who are imprisoned. And so many or most of the children who are arrested might not be sentenced by a military court. However, they still experience interrogation without their parents, without a lawyer. Oftentimes, once again, the use of solitary confinement, including extended solitary confinement, the use of intense psychological pressure amounting to torture or to cruel and inhumane treatment, very intense and traumatizing experience for children, for Palestinian children as young as 12. And the most common charge with when Palestinian children are dragged before military courts is that of throwing stones, allegedly throwing stones at Israeli occupiers. And this is actually the most common charge used against Palestinian children. Now, I want to also note that in many countries, there is a campaign to hold Israel accountable for its abuses against child prisoners. So, for example, in the United States and in Canada, there's the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, and this aims to, bring legislation forward and to also highlight the fact that many Western governments, particularly, for example, the United States, which provides $3.8 billion in military aid a year to the Israeli occupation, are held accountable and are restricted from providing that kind of support for the imprisonment and torture of Palestinian children. Political leaders are targeted. We hear about Marwan Barghouti, for example, Ahmed Sadat, the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There are multiple members of the Palestinian Legislative Council who are detained by the Israeli occupation. But at the same time, what we also see is, for example, there are hundreds of Palestinian university students that are detained by the Israeli occupation. So what you see is the targeting of anyone who can be a leader in their community and anyone who can inspire others to take a stand against the occupation. After Palestinian detainees are arrested, they're subjected to many different forms of torture, and we've seen very visible and violent examples of Israeli torture in recent years. Israel has attempted to make the claim in the past that it does not use these tactics anymore, or it only uses quote unquote moderate physical pressure. In the case of Samar Abid, who was seized by the Israeli occupation in 2019, he was a healthy man in his 40s when he was arrested on the street by the Israeli occupation. And several days later, he was taken to Hadassah Hospital with multiple broken ribs. He was unconscious and in a coma for weeks at a time. He developed pneumonia in the hospital after an Israeli soldier released a tear gas grenade inside his hospital room. And he developed kidney failure as a result of the Israeli occupation practices of torture. But that's one end, that's the physical torture. But in other cases, psychological torture is very common, especially for young prisoners and for women prisoners. There might be threats of sexual abuse or threats of physical abuse and arrests against family members and loved ones. Threats to arrest a mother or a father are frequently reported by Palestinian children who have been detained and interrogated by Israeli occupation forces. Now, after a Palestinian is arrested, interrogated, and goes through this experience of torture and detention, the purpose of this kind of torturous interrogation is to extract a confession. And it does not matter whether that confession is factual. What matters is that the confession exists. Obviously, the use of torture to extract confessions is known to produce false information, wrong information, and further is based on the criminalization of the rights, the very fundamental right of people living under occupation and colonialism to defend themselves and seek their freedom from that occupation and colonialism. So it's an unjust system and an unjust process to begin with. In many cases, and there have been, many Palestinian detainees who have developed kind of a culture of steadfastness inside Israeli prisons. And I would like to recommend the work of Palestinian academic Lina Meari, who has written extensively on this topic. And this culture of steadfastness includes refusing to confess despite incredibly difficult conditions, despite torture, despite abuse. And what that often means, however, is that those same Palestinians who refuse to confess under torture are then sent to administrative detention, which is detention without charge or trial. Now, administrative detention was actually first introduced into Palestine by the British colonial mandate over Palestine. And then after 1948, it was enthusiastically adopted by the new Israeli state following the Nakba and imposed upon the Palestinian population. And under an administrative detention order, which can be issued for 1 to 6 months at a time and is indefinitely renewable, and this is an order that's issued by a military commander. This means that Palestinians have been held for years in administrative detention. In one case, a Palestinian man was held for 11 years in administrative detention. Even when those terms of detention are not completely consecutive, there's a break. So for example, we see the case of Omar Barouti, who was jailed for 13 years of his life under administrative detention without charge or trial. This is based on secret information. The person who is being detained doesn't know what's in their secret file. Even their lawyer doesn't have access to what's in the secret file. So what this means is that there's no way to challenge that information. There's no way to obtain justice. There's no way to obtain accountability. The entire process is rigged from the beginning. And this is one reason why so many Palestinians jailed without charge or trial under administration need to take to hunger strikes in order to win their freedom, in order to even win a fixed date of the end of their detention. Because it's bad enough to be imprisoned by the Israeli occupation. It's bad enough to be locked behind bars, but it's perhaps even worse to never know when you're going to get out. And it's perhaps even worse for your family to never know when you will be free, or if you will be free, or if those dreams of freedom will once again be crushed. And this kind of administrative detention violates the Fourth Geneva Convention. It violates the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Israel attempts to claim that it has the right to detain Palestinians under clauses in international law, but the fact is that Israel's use of administrative detention is general, it is broad, it is used widely and massively against Palestinian civilian population. It is not used sparingly, it is not used rarely, and it is used simply as a form of removing Palestinians from the population, especially when we see people jailed without charge or trial under this form of detention for years and years at a time. I just want to mention a couple examples of Palestinians who are currently jailed under administrative detention. Now, again, there are 450 Palestinians right now imprisoned with no charge and no trial. So these stories are not exceptional. They are simply examples of the 450 different lives, experiences, and stories, all of which deserve to be heard, all of which deserve to be told, and for all of whom this form of isolation and oppression need to be broken. Kitam Safin is the president of the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees. She's an internationally known feminist leader. She's a member of the Global March of Women. She's spoken internationally on the political, social experiences of Palestinian women and their desire to be free from occupation. She is currently jailed without charge or trial under administrative detention. She had a 4-month administrative detention order issued against her. And 2 months ago, that detention order was renewed again for another 4 months. And there have been, many protests around the world demanding her release. Many women's organizations are calling for her freedom, but under the system of administrative detention, which is a form of arbitrary imprisonment, there's no mechanism to ensure her release. It should be noted that administrative detention orders are confirmed by the Israeli military courts, and we'll go into them a little bit shortly. And many Palestinians routinely appeal their administrative detention orders to the highest levels of the Israeli court system. But in all cases, there is universal and clear deference to military orders and complete disregard for the arguments and the rights and the freedoms of Palestinians who are subjected to this form of detention. This is Mohammed AlHalabi. Mohammed is a Palestinian student at Bethlehem University, and he's currently jailed without charge or trial under administrative detention. And what we see frequently are that student activists, people who are involved in the student councils on their campus, people who organize events, in many cases events exposing the crimes of the Israeli occupation or discussing Palestinian paths to freedom, are imprisoned by Israel, are imprisoned without charge or trial. Even things like membership in a student bloc on campus can be considered membership in a prohibited organization banned by an Israeli military order. And when they can't even kind of make those sorts of weak allegations, what we see are Palestinian university students locked away without charge and without trial. Now, if you're not sent to administrative detention, that doesn't mean that the other option offers any form of justice or accountability, because those are the military courts, the Israeli military courts, before which Palestinian civilians, once again, are those being brought. Palestinians from the West Bank are tried under Israeli military law. Palestinians from Gaza are sometimes tried under Israeli military courts and sometimes in Israeli civil courts following the quote unquote disengagement that doesn't reflect the fact that there is an ongoing siege and Gaza continues to be an occupied part of Palestine by the Israeli occupation. The judges and prosecutors are appointed by the Israeli military. In many cases, the entire proceedings take place in Hebrew and all important legal documents are in Hebrew. Israeli citizens are tried under a completely different legal system. So when we speak about Israeli apartheid, one of the clearest illustrations of what that apartheid looks like for Palestinians is the use of military courts. And it's important to note that Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians from 1948, occupied Palestine, if they are charged on a political charge, what Israel calls a security charge, then these same kind of rules, even though the court is ostensibly a civil court, the same kind of abuses and rules apply. So we see evidence obtained through torture, exceptionally long sentences, and a disregard for the rights of the person who is accused. And this is the same experience that we see for Palestinians in Jerusalem as well, who specifically often receive very lengthy sentences. And this kind of military law that's being used by the military courts are simply thousands and thousands of military orders, which are issued arbitrarily by the Israeli occupation military commander in the West Bank, which is in and of itself fundamentally illegitimate. These military courts convict Palestinians over 99% of the time. There is simply no system of justice. We can't even speak about the concept. When we talk about administrative detention, in many cases, we want to say charge them or release them because, of course, there's this obvious injustice of having no charges and no trial. But an Israeli military court isn't really a trial either. It's not a fair trial. The process which Palestinians experience completely violates all forms of international fair trial standards. Just to note back about Palestinian students, that there are hundreds of Palestinian students jailed by Israel at Birzeit University alone. In the 2019 to 2020 academic year, approximately 74 students were detained by Israeli occupation soldiers. One of the student blocs, the Progressive Democratic Student Poll, a leftist organization, was declared a prohibited organization by a military order, which means that just being a part of a student organization can have you sent to Israeli prison. And every year there are student elections on campuses. These are often targeted with raids, attacks, invasions of campuses. In fact, the student council president at Birzeit University is routinely arrested every single year following these elections. And this kind of targeting of Palestinian students is a systematic attack on the futures of Palestinians. It's an attempt to undermine the capacities of Palestinian youth to organize themselves. There are over 350 organizations that have joined a campaign to free Palestinian students. So I want to encourage people to visit the website at freepalestinianstudents.org and learn more about that campaign and what you can do to help build solidarity and support for Palestinian students. Now, Palestinians who are held under administrative detention, or even if they are, convicted by the military courts, face very damaging prison conditions, which are counterproductive to health. Palestinian youth and children are often denied access to meaningful education. In many cases, Palestinian children and youth lose kind of years of schooling due to the fact that they're not provided with an adequate education inside Israeli occupation prisons. And in the case of Palestinian girls, for example, there were months and months at a time when no teacher and no curriculum was being sent to the prison by the Israel Prison Service, which has that responsibility to provide those educational services. And so actually the Palestinian women detainees themselves, including Khalida Jarrar, who is a prominent Palestinian political leader and feminist and also an advocate for prisoners' rights, actually organized courses for Palestinian girls who are being detained, including in things like Arabic and math and history, whereas for the adult women detainees, she organized courses in human rights law and advocacy. So this is the kind of resistance and organizing and steadfastness that Palestinian prisoners practice behind bars despite the conditions imposed upon them by the Israeli occupation. Once again, there's a lack of basic amenities, poor hygiene, a lack of fresh air. In many cases, just basic things needed to clean the rooms in which Palestinian prisoners are jailed. They have to be purchased at a prison canteen, which is kind of a captive market for Palestinian prisoners. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, actually, these sanitary items were withdrawn from the canteen because Palestinian prisoners were kind of designated as a group of people that were to be prioritized the least. And so these, kind of sanitary supplies that weren't even available for purchase. So Palestinian prisoners could only just use like lemons to sanitize their areas. Um, and these conditions are also accentuated by ongoing medical and systematic medical neglect and abuse. Palestinian political prisoners are regularly denied medical care if they complain of pain, if they complain of illness, if they exhibit symptoms and request medical testing. In many cases, that testing is not provided, it is delayed, it is denied. And what that has meant in many cases is that Palestinian detainees um, experience very serious progressive conditions such as cancer, which is not detected until years after it would have been most effective to detect their disease, essentially sentencing them to death due to medical neglect and abuse. And so when we speak about this internationally, there are several reasons why it's important to talk about the issue of administrative detention and to support Palestinian political prisoners behind Israeli bars. And those include supporting the rights of Palestinians to organize and to resist occupation, supporting those who are living daily on the front line, experiencing suffering and struggling for freedom. Palestinian prisoners and detainees are a point of Palestinian unity who represent real leadership of the population. And in addition, organizing to support Palestinian prisoners is also an opportunity for internationalism and joint struggle. When we look around the world, from Turkey to the Philippines, we see political prisoners locked behind bars. When we look at systems of injustice, from the genocide of Indigenous people in Canada to the mass incarceration of targeting the Black community in the United States, we see similarities in the use of incarceration as a colonial tool. And organizing to bring an end to administrative detention and to support Palestinian prisoners is an important way to build that internationalist aspect of organizing. Just to note that Palestinian prisoners constantly resist occupation. They boycott the military courts, they engage in hunger strikes individually and collectively. They teach themselves and each other. They turn the prisons into schools for Palestinian liberation and education of each other. And this resistance, like those of the hunger strikers, it's so important to support and to highlight on an international level, because Israel wants to keep Palestinian detainees isolated. Israel throws people in jail without charge or trial because it wants to take them away from their families, their communities, and from the international social justice movement of which they are a part. And it becomes our responsibility to highlight their stories, to bring their voices forward, and to make sure that their names, that those, 450 names of administrative detainees, those 4,500 names of Palestinian political prisoners, are not obscured, are not left behind, and are not isolated. And just to conclude, I just wanted to say that there are things that people can do. You can get involved with boycott campaigns. There's a global Palestinian call to boycott Israeli goods, products, cultural and academic institutions that support occupation and apartheid. This is also a way of taking a stand to end administrative detention and free Palestinian political prisoners. Get involved in social justice movements in your area, because every victory for justice everywhere is a victory for Palestine and for Palestinian prisoners. Join campaigns like Free Palestinian Students. No Way to Treat a Child is an excellent campaign for the liberation of Palestinian child prisoners. And of course, you can get involved with Samidun. We're a grassroots organization based on kind of internationalist mobilization and organizing to highlight the stories and experiences of Palestinian prisoners and work for their freedom. We organize protests, advocacy actions, pressuring lawmakers, and many other different types of actions. We have chapters around the world, and we'd love to see people get involved. And of course, we also know that there are so many organizations doing really important work in this area. And so all of the work that's being done is worthwhile and important to support. I want to encourage people to visit our website at samadun.net to learn more about anything that we've spoken about today. Thank you again, and I look forward to the question and answer period in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. This was very interesting. Many people asked the question, will it be possible to have access or to have the presentation available?
Yes, I will be happy to share I'll be happy to share the presentation. I believe I'll send it to Ryan, and he will distribute it with the follow-up email that goes out about this.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So there are a number of questions. You mentioned the category of 1948 Palestinian prisoners. What does it mean?
Oh, thanks so much. This is the characterization, the categorization that's actually used by Ademir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, which is one of the major associations inside Palestine that provides legal and family support to Palestinian political prisoners. So 1948 Palestinian prisoners are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Who are designated as quote unquote security prisoners by the Israeli occupation and who are subject to the same kind of political imprisonment and repression, despite the fact that as Israeli citizens, they should ostensibly have access to the same protections of that Israeli Jewish citizens of Israel have, but the fact is that that's not the case, especially, for example, if we compare people who carry out, for example, right-wing violence. Those cases are not treated as security cases, and in many cases, perpetrators of right-wing violence, settler violence against Palestinians, and also right-wing violence inside Israel are given very light sentences if they are sentenced at all, whereas we see Palestinians classified as security prisoners and again subjected to, even though their trial might take place in a civil court, you see the use of torture evidence, you see the denial of rights to lawyers, you see ongoing restrictions, and then after that person is in jail, they're denied access to kind of rights that are considered basic for other detainees, for Israeli Jewish detainees in Israeli prisons, for example, such as conjugal visits, the right to parole, the right to leave. None of those are available to Palestinian political prisoners from 1948 occupied Palestine or who are citizens of Israel.
Thank you. How many prisoners are followed by Amnesty International?
Unfortunately, Amnesty International has not always, Amnesty International does some great work around Palestine. However, Amnesty International has used very restrictive classifications in terms of how it recognizes who is a prisoner of conscience. However, Amnesty has discussed some of the cases that I mentioned. The case of Khitam Safin has been discussed by Amnesty International. Khalida Jarrar, the Palestinian feminist and parliamentarian, her case, currently she is sentenced, but she was held under administrative detention the last time she was jailed by Israel. This was a case that was taken up by Amnesty International. And Amnesty International has very clearly recognized that administrative detention, this form of detention without charge or trial, is a complete violation of international law, a complete violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and something that is a tremendous human rights abuse. Now, there are a number of different actions that people take to release Palestinian political prisoners. The hunger strikes have been a major point of mobilization. In some cases, these are collective hunger strikes involving thousands of Palestinian prisoners and detainees. In other cases, they are individual hunger strikes. Perhaps people may have heard the name of Khader Adnan from Jenin, who in 2012 was held under administrative detention. In fact, hunger strikes, especially individual hunger strikes, are almost always carried out by administrative detainees in particular, because it has shown itself to be one of the only ways in which people can obtain a clear end to their detention by the Israeli occupation. And Kader Adnan's case kind of drew a lot of international attention to the struggle of Palestinians and to the injustice of administrative detention. This was one such campaign. Right now, it is on April 17th was Palestinian Prisoners Day. And this is kind of an international day that was first marked in 1974 by the Palestinian National Council, but continues to be organized by solidarity organizations around the world. And so there are events in many cities and many areas for Palestinian Prisoners Day this year. And the Week of Action for Palestinian Prisoners is still going on. Many of the prominent political leaders have campaigns for them. So people like Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Sadat, Khaled Jarrar, there are a lot of mobilizations for their release. The Interparliamentary Union has called for the release of leaders such as these who are also Palestinian parliamentarians. And the Campaign to Free Palestinian Students is also a campaign that is gathering a lot of attention with student groups, student unions in France, the Netherlands, Canada, and elsewhere, organizing actions and solidarity days to highlight specifically the struggles of Palestinian students behind bars.
Thank you. Could you post the actions that we can take again, please? And we could elaborate. Is it still possible to do this?
Sure, I will repost the actions in the I will repost the actions in the chat. And just to, I wanted to not exceed the time limits that we have, because they're there for a good reason, so we can get into the discussion. But there are, and I will also, the No Way to Treat a Child link is one that is that Ryan put in the chat or either. And if there's a No Way to Treat a Child campaign in your country, this is a great action that you can take and get involved and contact legislators about specifically the crimes being committed against Palestinian children.
Thank you. And it will be also available in the presentation when we send it out, or when Ryan sends it out. Which organizations are compiling numbers on Palestinian prisoners?
So largely these are Palestinian human rights organizations, and these are Palestinian human rights organizations, as well as academics and scholars that are going to kind of both look into Israeli archives and also go through public information releases or compiling testimonies from survivors who have gone through experiences. And I think that's sometimes why you might see contradictory numbers, is because unfortunately, it is the victims of colonialism that are left to gather this information and to document it as clearly as possible. And in many cases, what we have discovered is that the numbers are actually larger than what has been seen before. For example, there's recently been by Salman Abu Sitta and others, a lot of discussion about the use of specifically detention camps that were a form of forced labor camps for Palestinians expelled, for Palestinians who remained in Palestine, in what was labeled Israel after the Nakba, and that this was actually a widely used experience, but it hadn't been kind of included in stories and reporting and about the Nakba. And so this added hundreds, if not thousands of more detainees to that kind of historical record. And so just to note, like even today, Palestinian human rights organizations are dependent on the releases given by the Israeli Prison Administration, which they are required to give under law. However, when they don't fill that position, as was the case for a huge percentage of last year, you'll see approximate numbers, approximate information being given. And that is because that they left that position unfilled. And so it was nearly impossible for organizations trying to do like the work of providing legal representation under occupation to compile those statistics. So we'd love to have the reason these are definitely in many cases approximate numbers, but they are numbers that reflect just how extensive in all cases those numbers are extensive. They do not vary widely in a statistical sense, and in all cases they reflect just how widespread the use of incarceration is by the Israeli occupation.
Thank you. How does Samidun relate to or work with Ademir?
Ademir is an amazing organization. We do very different kinds of work. Ademir provides direct legal and family support, is based inside Palestine, and they also focus a lot of their advocacy at the United Nations level. Samidun is an international grassroots organization that works to build solidarity on campuses, in unions, in churches, and in communities with Palestinian political prisoners, put pressure on legislators, and support the struggle of Palestinian political prisoners in a wide range of different environments. So in many cases, I would say that this work is kind of mutually supportive and comes together in order to provide the very different kinds of support and organizing that are necessary, all of which are critically necessary to break the isolation of Palestinian political prisoners imposed by Israel. And there are actually, I mean, Ademir is a tremendous organization that does amazing work. There are a number of organizations on the ground in Palestine that do different kinds of legal advocacy and support or provide lawyers for Palestinian political prisoners. And this is all tremendous work, and I encourage everyone to follow Ademir's website to read their information that they provide, because they do have some tremendous resources and profiles of Palestinian prisoners that can be very useful in any kind of organizing. One of Ademir's campaigns that they are focusing on right now is exposing military courts. And so there's a social media campaign to tweet with the hashtag against military courts. And Ademir actually provides kind of the language to put on a sign to take a selfie and to put that online. And so this is another campaign that people can be a part of.
What are the channels through which our governments, and it's asked by internationals, are briefed on or confronted with these numbers?
In many cases, I mean, I can say that we as Samidun in different areas and cities, at least in terms of our international work, we also have a chapter inside Occupied Palestine, which organizes communication with the prisoners, support for their families, protests and actions. But our chapters outside Palestine regularly contact government officials, provide these numbers and information. I know that many of the Palestinian human rights organizations also do this work, especially at the United Nations and at the UN Human Rights Council. And we write letters to members of Congress, members of Parliament, members of European Parliament to provide this information. And I know that there are many other groups that also provide that information as well. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that even in the cases of Palestinian child prisoners, it's still a tremendous struggle to hold governments that are involved in supporting Israel accountable for their actions. And it really requires ongoing and sustained pressure. For example, when there is a hunger strike, when there is this kind of critical moment, in many cases, there are call-in days in which people call their members of parliament and their members of Congress, depending on where they are, to say that this is an issue and our government is continuing to support Israel, whether that is in the case of the United States with tremendous amounts of military aid and economic aid, which is directly enabling these crimes, or in the cases of many European states that even though there might be kind of expressed criticisms by the EU of administrative detention, what we see in practice is that is an ongoing failure to hold Israel accountable or to exclude Israel from, say, research and development programs, or to put an end to the EU-Israel trade association agreement that would actually impose some real accountability on the Israeli occupation for these ongoing crimes, because we think that that kind of international accountability is necessary in order to support the struggles of Palestinians seeking liberation.
In the case of Mohammed AlHalabi, the former World Vision Director for Gaza, is he considered a political prisoner?
Yes, absolutely. And I thank you so much for raising this case. This case is incredibly important. It's a true example of a real travesty of justice. Now, Mohammed AlHalabi's case, for those who do not know, Mohammed AlHalabi is as was stated, the former World Vision Director in Gaza. He has now been imprisoned for nearly 5 years by Israel. He was arrested when he attempted to travel to the West Bank. He had a permit, because of his position to leave. And instead of being allowed to travel, in another form of siege imposed upon Gaza, he was seized by Israeli occupation forces. And not only was he arrested and subjected to torture and abuse, as has been documented by his lawyer, Israeli officials, including Benjamin Netanyahu, organized a massive press campaign to attack him. Sorry, I'm just typing his name as requested in the chat, organized a massive campaign to attack him and to say that he had been using charitable funds to support Hamas, and that this was a crime, and that, Palestinians in Gaza don't care about their own people, and just kind of this really horrible stream of abuse. Well, it's come out. I mean, World Vision did an audit, the Australian government did an audit, and the Israeli allegations are so outrageous that the amount of money that Mohammed AlHalabi was accused of, embezzling to Hamas is greater than the entire budget of World Vision in Gaza for 10 years. The entire allegations are completely kind of fantastical and outside the realm of reality. And because of that, Mohammed AlHalabi has refused to take a plea bargain. He was told that if he was offered as has been spoken about by his family, his father, who is a tremendous advocate for his son, and by his attorney, he was offered a 3-year plea agreement that if he pled guilty, he would be sentenced to 3 years in prison and he would be released. If he had agreed to that plea agreement, he would be out of jail by now. But because he insists on his innocence and on proving his innocence, he's refused to sign the plea agreement. And what we've seen is this ongoing amount of delays. There have been 157 court hearings in the case of Mohammed AlHalabi and no progress in the case. And he continues to be jailed in this seemingly endless trial that never comes to an end, that is constantly postponed, and is another form of punishment being imposed upon him for refusing to make a plea agreement and agree to plead guilty to a crime that he is innocent of, or to a charge that he is innocent of. I would not label it a crime, but Israel considers it one. And it's also important to note that in a lot of the cases of people sentenced by the military courts, plea bargains do come into play. And the reason why Palestinian prisoners take plea bargains is because they know that if they don't, this is what will happen. They will be endlessly taken back and forth to the military courts. They will be endlessly postponed. And in the end, they will get a longer sentence. And so this is a tremendous means of pressure used to once again extract false confessions and unjust verdicts against Palestinians. And then after they are finally released, especially if they are human rights defenders, if they're involved internationally, Israeli government officials then attempt to smear these same victims of political persecution as convicted criminals. And we've seen this at many levels from the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and from Israeli officials at multiple levels. And so this, compounds the kind of injustice against those targeted for political imprisonment.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for asking the amazing questions you did. Unfortunately, we can't answer every question today. I'd briefly like to point out our Kumi entry and action for the week. Links will be shared in the chat. The Kumi action for this week. Look at the list. Look at the list of prisoners on the Ademir website and pick a name from the list of individuals who have been detained recently. You can also use the names of the prisoners who are on hunger strike currently. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you are yourself were suffering. Hebrews 13:3. Blindfold yourself for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour. Do not talk, do not eat, do not drink. Think about how you can end this exercise at any time, but this prisoner held by authorities who do not respect the rule of law does not have this luxury. How would that feel? What impact will it have on your own family? Then write about your feelings and understanding of administrative detention and the inhumane treatment of detainees in a solidarity letter. Share your writings on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Be sure to begin your post with a clear message, noting your own privileges such as, I could stop this exercise at any time, but prisoners in administrative detention could not. You could also share a photo of yourself blindfolded. Include a link to this page of the Kumi Now website along with the hashtag StopAD, hashtag Kumi Now, and hashtag Kumi16. This activity can be done individually or in a group, privately or in public. If done with a school or church group, consider discussing your feelings before or after you write. The goal is to help people understand that administrative detention is not just ordinary prison with a more sinister name, but an actual system of abuse and torture that has no place in any society. We are sharing with you the Ademir website. I'd like to give our guest an opportunity to chime in. Charlotte, do you have any thoughts about the Kumi action or other ways that people watching can help push back against Israel's use of administrative detention?
This is a very important action, and I also want to encourage people, in addition to posting these stories and letters and experiences on your social media sites, we are organizing a project with Samidoun in occupied Palestine, which is a letters project. Apologies, I actually sent the wrong link in the chat. But it is a project of letters to and messages to Palestinian prisoners from internationals. And what our comrades in Samidoun and occupied Palestine are going to do is take these messages that are received, translate them into Arabic, and read them over one of the radio stations that plays messages that the prisoners listen to, because they know that there's a program where family members and supporters and friends will call and leave messages for them. And so they are going to be putting forward these messages to the prisoners so they hear them directly. So if there's someone that you want to connect with, someone's story that you want to reach and you want them to hear that story, please visit our website at samidoun.net/letters and send that experience there as well. And it will be part of these radio messages that are relayed over the radio to Palestinian political prisoners and are also shared with their family members and loved ones by the Samidoun chapter in occupied Palestine. And once again, I want to encourage people to get involved in campaigns to free Palestinian prisoners and also in campaigns to boycott Israel, because only by putting real, meaningful material pressure on the Israeli occupation can crimes like administrative detention be brought to an end.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so. And it will be shared in the next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. We would greatly appreciate if you shared this amazing session with your friends and colleagues, as well as information on our future sessions. We have recently also decided not to include a registration link to make it easier for people. So the link that you have used today, which we have also sent and we will continue to send, will be the link that you need to use to have access and participate in the Kumi Now sessions. Next week, we will address Israel's nation-state law and others like it, and how they contribute to the discrimination of Palestinian citizens of Israel. If you'd like to be reminded of the online gathering an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at kuminow.com/online using the form at the bottom of the page. We hope to see you back here next week. Thanks again, and good night or good morning, depending where you are.